My name is Almira Watson. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my adult life, I have been what people politely call reliable. I live in Manchester, though I grew up just outside the city. I work in healthcare administration, the kind of job that requires calm under pressure, discretion, and a tolerance for being the person everyone calls when something goes wrong. On paper, I'm steady, responsible, capable. In my family, I was something else entirely. I was the emergency contact, not the favourite, not the celebrated one, not the one whose birthday plans were debated weeks in advance or whose choices were defended at dinner. I was simply the name you wrote down on forms when you needed someone to answer the phone at 2:17. Mum. For years, that role felt like quiet validation. Being needed can masquerade as being valued. And I didn't question it, not at first. I told myself that some people shine and others steady the lights. I told myself that strength didn't need applause. I told myself that love wasn't always loud. The truth is more complicated, because when you are always the first to answer, you rarely notice how often you're the last to be considered. This isn't a story about dramatic betrayal. No inheritance battles, no screaming matches across kitchen tables. There were no slammed doors or shocking confessions. What happened to me unfolded slowly in polite conversations, in overlooked invitations, in subtle pauses where my opinion wasn't requested. It took years for me to understand the shape of the role I had been assigned, and it took one small decision, almost invisible from the outside, to change everything. When I stopped answering first, everything slowed down, not just for me. For everyone. What follows isn't revenge. There was no explosion, no triumphant speech. Just silence, chosen silence, and the quiet rearranging of priorities. This is a story about emotional economics, about what happens when the most dependable person in the room begins to measure their own worth differently, about what shifts when availability is no longer unconditional, and about what people reveal when the safety net steps back. I'm telling this not to accuse anyone. I'm telling it because so many of us carry roles we never consciously agreed to. We become the responsible sibling, the stable friend, the one who can handle it. And somewhere along the way, we forget to ask whether we are being loved or merely relied upon. I was the family's emergency contact, but never the favourite. Have you ever realised that being needed isn't the same thing as being cherished? I was never the loud one. In family photos, I'm usually standing slightly to the side, not cropped out, not excluded, just positioned in that quiet middle ground between essential and forgettable. If you look carefully, you'll notice something consistent. I'm always holding something, a coat, a bag, a toddler, someone else's phone. That detail explains more than it should. To my parents, I was the sensible daughter, the one who didn't need monitoring. My younger sister, Leona, was the vibrant one, spontaneous, emotional, creative. She made bold choices. She made mistakes. She made scenes. And because of that, she occupied oxygen, I occupied space. When relatives visited, they'd ask Leona about her latest adventure, her new boyfriend, her artistic projects. When they turned to me, it was usually logistical. Almira, could you help your mum in the kitchen? Almira, you're good with paperwork. Can you check this? Almira, you don't mind driving, do you? I didn't mind. That's the dangerous part, because when you rarely protest, people stop checking whether you should. I became the family's quiet infrastructure. Birthdays, I organised reservations. Medical appointments, I tracked them. Mortgage letters, insurance renewals, travel confirmations if it involved clarity and responsibility. It drifted toward me. At some point in my late 20s, my name was listed as the emergency contact for nearly everyone in my immediate family. Not because we had a discussion, because I was the obvious choice. There's a strange compliment hidden inside that kind of trust. It sounds like respect, but trust without tenderness can feel like an assignment. I remember once overhearing my aunt say, "If anything serious ever happens, Almira will handle it." She meant it kindly, but no one ever said, "If Almira is overwhelmed, who will handle her?" I don't share this with resentment. At the time, I wore the role almost proudly. Being dependable gave me identity. While Leona was discovering herself, I was establishing stability. I built a steady career. I saved diligently. I bought a modest flat by 32. I didn't need rescuing, which meant I was never prioritized. At family dinners, if two conversations overlapped, mine was the one that paused. If two needs collided, mine was the one that waited. It wasn't malicious. It was momentum. Everyone had subconsciously agreed that I would adjust. And I always did. There's an invisibility that comes not from being ignored, but from being assumed. They assumed I would come, assumed I would answer, assumed I would absorb inconvenience like it was part of my anatomy. When my father had minor surgery, I rearranged my work schedule without hesitation. When Leona's relationship ended dramatically, she stayed at my flat for 6 weeks. When my mother misplaced important documents, I rebuilt the system from scratch. No one forced me. That's important. I volunteered because I believed love looked like availability. What I didn't realize was that constant availability quietly trains people to expect immediate access. And expectation, when unexamined, hardens into entitlement. Still, if you had asked me then whether I felt unappreciated, I would have said no. I truly believed I was simply the strong one, the capable one, the adult in the room. I thought being the emergency contact meant I was trusted most. It took me years to understand that I was trusted to manage, not chosen to cherish. The distinction is subtle, but it changes everything. The first cut didn't look like a wound. It looked like a dinner reservation. It was my 33rd birthday, not a milestone year, not one that demands spectacle, but old enough to feel the quiet weight of time. I had booked a small Italian restaurant near Deansgate. Nothing dramatic, just immediate family. I even chose a place Leona liked. I remember arriving early, as I always did. I smoothed the tablecloth with my palms and checked my phone for messages. There were none yet, but that wasn't unusual. My family tended to arrive exactly on time or slightly late, depending on who the event was for. Leona texted 15 minutes before we were meant to meet. Running late, something came up. No explanation. Just that. My parents arrived on time. We ordered drinks. We waited. 25 minutes passed. Then 40. I could see it happening, the subtle recalibration of attention. My mother is checking her phone. My father is asking whether we should order starters so the kitchen doesn't get overwhelmed. The waiter returned with polite concern in his eyes. Leona finally arrived nearly an hour late. She was glowing. That's what struck me. Not apologetic, not flustered, glowing. She had run into someone, a former colleague, and they'd lost track of time. She was animated, breathless, mid-story before she'd even taken her coat off. My parents leaned in instantly, and something inside me registered a shift. No one asked her to lower her voice. No one reminded her that we had been waiting. No one said, "It's Almira's birthday." Instead, my mother smiled and said, "Oh, that sounds exciting." The waiter brought another chair. We reordered drinks. The evening continued. On the surface, nothing was wrong. But there was a moment small enough to miss when the attention that had briefly centered on me dissolved entirely. My birthday became background noise to Leona's encounter. Her story stretched across courses. My father laughed louder than usual. My mother asked follow-up questions. I remember picking at my pasta and telling myself not to be petty. She didn't mean anything by it. It wasn't intentional. She's just like that. I've always been good at explaining other people's behavior in ways that protect them from accountability. That night, when the bill came, my father insisted on paying. "For the birthday girl," he said warmly, and I smiled. But here's the detail that stayed with me. When the waiter asked whose birthday it was because someone had mentioned it, my mother gestured vaguely in my direction and said, "Almira's, but we're really just glad everyone could make it." Just glad everyone could make it, even the one who hadn't. That sentence was the cut. Not because it was cruel, it wasn't. It was generous, inclusive, harmonizing. But it erased the point of the gathering. And something in me, something quiet and observant, took note. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't sulk. I didn't withdraw. I drove my parents home afterward because Leona had another early morning. I thanked everyone for coming. I even texted the next day to say how lovely it had been. But for the first time, I noticed the pattern. When attention was scarce, it tilted predictably, and I was sturdy enough to survive without it. That was the logic. The dependable ones don't need the spotlight. The dependable ones don't make scenes. The dependable ones understand. That dinner wasn't dramatic. It was simply informative. It told me, without announcement, exactly where I ranked when celebration and accommodation competed in the same room. And once you see something clearly, even briefly, you can't fully unsee it. I didn't change that night, but I started remembering, after that birthday, nothing dramatic shifted. That's how normalization works. It doesn't announce itself. It repeats gently until your nervous system stops reacting. The next instance was smaller. A Sunday lunch at my parents' house. I had offered to bring dessert. I arrived with a lemon tart from a bakery I liked light, delicate, something different from the usual supermarket sponge. When I walked into the kitchen, my mother smiled distractedly. "Oh, good, you're here. Could you finish the roast your father's outside with Leona?" I put the tart down, tied an apron around my waist, took over. Through the open window, I could hear laughter from the garden. Leona's voice carried easily. She was describing a new freelance project she might take something bold and uncertain. My father's responses were animated, invested. I basted the chicken. When we sat down to eat, my mother complimented the roast. "It turned out beautifully," she said, looking pleased. No one corrected her. I didn't either. Again, not malicious, just momentum. Later, when the lemon tart was served, my aunt, who had joined us unexpectedly, asked where it was from. Before I could answer, my mother said, "Oh, Almira picked something up on her way." Picked something up! As if effort only counted when it was visible. I noticed the language. I always notice language. But I swallowed the correction. Because it felt small, petty, unnecessary to defend. That became my internal refrain. It's not worth it. Then came something slightly heavier. My parents were reviewing their wills. Nothing alarming, just routine updates. My father mentioned it casually over tea one evening. "We've listed you as the executor," he said, as though commenting on the weather. I blinked. "Oh, it just makes sense," my mother added. "You're organized." Leona was in the room. She didn't object. She didn't volunteer. She just shrugged lightly and said, "I'd be terrible at that stuff anyway." Everyone laughed. And there it was again. The role: reliable, practical, capable, emotionally durable. I wasn't asked if I wanted the responsibility. It was assumed I would accept it. Of course I would. That's what I did. I absorbed weight. I told myself it was an honor. And perhaps it was. But no one asked whether I wanted to be the one sorting paperwork while grieving. No one considered whether the organized daughter might also want to simply be a daughter. When small patterns repeat, they begin to define the architecture of a relationship. I was the one who arrived early, the one who stayed late to clean, the one who double-checked reservations, the one who carried spare chargers, extra tissues, and backup plans. And when plans changed because Leona had a new opportunity, or a new crisis, or a new emotional spiral, I adjusted. Always me. Not because I was told to, because I was conditioned to. There's a subtle kind of disrespect that hides inside praise. "You're so strong. You're the calm one. We don't have to worry about you." Sounds flattering. But what it really means is you require less tending. And over time, that morphs into you deserve less tending. I didn't wake up one morning feeling resentful. I woke up, gradually realizing that my needs were always the most negotiable in the room. And I was the one negotiating them down. I had become so skilled at minimizing my own expectations that others no longer felt obligated to consider them. That realization wasn't loud. It was clinical, a quiet internal audit. I started replaying conversations in my head, noticing how often I apologized for having preferences, how frequently I said, "It's fine," how easily I surrendered dates, times, and locations. "It's fine." It wasn't untrue. I could handle it. But handling something and accepting it are not the same. By the end of that year, I had built a reputation in my family. "Almira will sort it." The problem was, no one had asked whether Almira wanted to keep sorting it forever. And I hadn't yet asked myself either. It wasn't a confrontation that made me see it. It was a seating arrangement. We were at my cousin Daniel's engagement party, a bright, rented hall with folding chairs draped in white fabric and fairy lights strung across the ceiling. Nothing extravagant, just warm, familiar. I arrived early, naturally. My aunt was flustered because the caterer had delivered fewer vegetarian meals than expected. Someone had misplaced the printed guest list. A child was crying near the entrance because his balloon had floated to the ceiling. Within 15 minutes of walking in, I was holding tape, reallocating place cards, and coordinating with the catering staff. No one told me to. They just looked at me, and I moved. It was muscle memory at that point, scanning for problems, solving quietly, restoring order. I felt competent in that space, needed, grounded. When the ceremony portion began, everyone filtered toward the front rows. I was still near the back, double-checking that the caterer had adjusted the plates. By the time I sat down, the front seats were full. Leona was in the second row between my parents. Someone had left a chair open beside her, but a family friend slid into it just as I approached. She didn't notice me standing there. She was mid-laughter, mid-conversation, animated and easy. I took a seat near the aisle instead. It wasn't painful. It was clarifying. Throughout the speeches, Daniel thanked everyone who helped make today possible. He gestured vaguely toward the room. My aunt later hugged me and said, "We couldn't have done it without you." And she meant it. But during the actual event, the visible, photographed, celebrated portion, I wasn't positioned as central. I was a peripheral support. That night, driving home, I replayed the pattern. In every family dynamic, there are roles people slide into unconsciously: the peacemaker, the rebel, the achiever, the fragile one, the entertainer. Mine was the stabilizer. Reliable, useful, emotionally steady, invisible in joy, essential in a crisis. I began to understand something unsettling. My family didn't disrespect me intentionally. They simply structured around me. They leaned in my direction because I didn't wobble. And because I didn't wobble, they stopped checking whether I was carrying too much. There's a quiet transaction that happens when you consistently perform strength. People begin to assume it costs you nothing. But it does. It costs you spontaneity. It costs you to be pursued. It costs you to be surprised. I thought back to my birthday dinner, to the roast lunch, to the executor conversation, to dozens of small moments I hadn't named. A memory surfaced from years earlier, my university graduation. I had received a distinction, a quiet achievement. My parents attended. Of course, Leona arrived late because she had overslept. After the ceremony, my father suggested we keep it low-key because Leona wasn't feeling well. We went home instead of celebrating. I hadn't questioned it then, but suddenly I saw the through line. My milestones were adjustable, her moods were immovable, and I had agreed to that arrangement without negotiation. The role wasn't imposed with cruelty, it was shaped through repetition, through my own cooperation, through my belief that maturity meant self-erasure. The hardest realization wasn't that they relied on me, it was that I had made it safe for them to, by never signaling a limit, by never expressing disappointment, by never allowing inconvenience to land where it originated. I absorbed it instead. That evening, sitting in my flat with my planner open on the coffee table, I wrote something down for the first time. What would happen if I stopped responding immediately? It wasn't a threat. It was a question, and it lingered, because roles feel permanent until you consider stepping slightly outside them. I wasn't angry. I was curious. And curiosity, I would learn, is far more disruptive than resentment. The shift didn't happen during a fight. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, in the most ordinary way possible. I was at work when my phone vibrated. My mother's name lit up the screen. I stepped into the corridor to answer instinctive, automatic. "Hi, Mum!" Her voice was tight. "Your father's blood pressure's high again. The GP can't see him until next week. I don't know what to do." I felt it immediately, that familiar tightening in my chest. The internal checklist is assembling itself. Private clinic options, medication adjustments, scheduling, transportation. "I'll sort it," I said. 3 words. Reflexive. I opened my calendar while she was still speaking. I began rearranging my afternoon. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, "Leona's at a cafe with friends, so I didn't want to bother her." The sentence landed softly. Not cruelly, not deliberately, just factually. I paused. "Did you ask her?" I heard myself say. A small silence. "Well, no. She's had a stressful week." So had I. But that thought stayed inside my head. I booked a private appointment, drove across the city after work, sat beside my father while he grumbled about the unnecessary fuss, collected prescriptions, drove them home. Everything resolved smoothly. It usually did. But that night, back in my flat, I didn't feel the usual quiet pride. I felt hollow. Not because I had helped. Helping wasn't the issue. It was the assumption, the automatic bypassing of one daughter to reach the other. Leona hadn't even been given the opportunity to step up. Because everyone, including me, knew I would. I sat at my kitchen table long after midnight, the lights off except for the one above the stove. The city hummed faintly outside my window. I asked myself something I had avoided for years. If I disappeared tomorrow, would they know how much I carried? Or would they simply scramble confused because the system had failed? That question frightened me more than anger ever could. I didn't want to be a system. I wanted to be a person. A week later, another call came, this time from Leona. Her car had broken down on the motorway. She was upset, dramatic, breathless. "I don't know what to do," she said. "Can you come?" I checked the time. 6:40 p.m. I had just sat down to eat. I had a report due the next morning. The old version of me would have stood up immediately, grabbed my coat, driven out without hesitation. Instead, I did something microscopic. I waited 3 seconds before answering. 3 quiet seconds. Then I said, calmly, "Have you called roadside assistance?" A pause. "No," I just thought. "They'll get to you faster than I can. Call them first. Stay in the car. Text me the location." There was confusion in her silence. Not anger, just surprise. "Oh, right, okay." We hung up. I didn't move. I finished my dinner. 10 minutes later, she texted, "They're on the way." No crisis, no escalation. Nothing collapsed. The world continued. That was the moment. Not dramatic, not rebellious, just a tiny interruption of the pattern. I realized something profound in its simplicity. I had mistaken immediacy for love. But love doesn't require self-erasure. By not rushing, I hadn't abandoned her. I had simply allowed the appropriate solution to occur without sacrificing myself. And something in me, something that had been perpetually on call, exhaled. I didn't announce a boundary. I didn't deliver a speech. I simply stopped answering first. And everything slowed down. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. After the motorway incident, I didn't declare a new philosophy. I just began practicing restraint. It started with response time. When my mother texted in the family group chat, "Does anyone know where we put the insurance documents?" I saw it immediately. My thumb hovered over the screen. Normally, I would have replied within seconds, outlining the exact folder, shelf, and backup digital copy location. Instead, I set my phone down. Not definitely, not dramatically, just down. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Then something interesting happened. Leona replied, "I'm not sure, but didn't Almira scan them last year?" I watched the screen light up again. My mother responded, "Yes, that sounds right." Almira. There it was, the gravitational pull returning to its center. I didn't pick up the phone. An hour later, my father sent another message, found them in the hall drawer. A simple resolution. No one panicked. No one accused me of neglect. No catastrophe unfolded. But something subtle shifted in the ecosystem. For years, I had believed that if I didn't respond immediately, the system would stall, that everything relied on my speed. It didn't. It relied on my willingness. And willingness is different from necessity. I began applying that same restraint elsewhere. When Leona called late at night to vent about a disagreement with a friend, I let it ring twice before answering. When she launched into the story, I listened, but I didn't immediately offer strategy or solutions. I asked, "What do you think you'll do?" The question unsettled her more than advice ever had. "I don't know," she said slowly. And for once, I didn't feel the silence. Silence is uncomfortable when people are used to you cushioning it. I noticed that without my quick problem-solving, conversations took longer to land, decisions stretched. People had to think. They had to sit with their own discomfort for a few seconds more. They interpreted my slower responses as busyness at first. "You've been quiet lately," my mother remarked one Sunday. "Work's been full," I replied truthfully. That was the beauty of it. Nothing I was doing was hostile. I wasn't withdrawing love. I wasn't refusing help. I was simply no longer preemptively rescuing. There's a difference between support and interception. For years, I had intercepted every inconvenience before it matured into responsibility for someone else. Now, I let the inconvenience breathe. And in that breathing space, I began noticing something else. People recalibrated when they couldn't rely on my immediate presence. Leona scheduled her own GP appointment 1 week without consulting me. My father learned how to reset the router instead of calling. My mother began double-checking paperwork before handing it off. Not perfectly, but noticeably. Meanwhile, an unexpected quiet formed in my evenings. I started reading again, not articles about healthcare policy or estate planning, but novels I had been meaning to explore. I went for walks without checking my phone every 5 minutes. I left messages unanswered until morning. The world did not collapse. What collapsed was the illusion that I was indispensable, and that realization was both humbling and liberating. Because if I wasn't indispensable to the system, then I was free to redefine my place within it. There were small consequences. A slight tone shift in Leona's voice when I didn't immediately rearrange my schedule. A puzzled look from my mother when I said, "I can't this week." They weren't angry. They were adjusting. And adjustment always feels like friction before it feels like balance. The most surprising part, I wasn't exhausted anymore. For the first time in years, I wasn't operating on emotional standby. Silence had become intentional. Not punishment. Not protest. Just presence redirected. I had stopped answering first. And in that pause, I started hearing myself. When you stop rushing, you start observing. The silence I had begun practicing wasn't empty. It created space, and in that space, I saw things more clearly than ever before. For years, I had been reacting. Now, I was studying. I noticed how often family plans were made around Leona's availability without discussion. How phrases like, "she's going through a lot," were used as shields. How my steadiness had become background noise reliable enough not to require reinforcement. But instead of confronting anyone, I did something quieter. I started documenting, not in a vindictive way, not building a case, just recording reality. In my black leather planner, alongside work deadlines and grocery lists, I began noting patterns. Offered to host, date changed last minute, handled dad's prescription refill no follow-up, Leona upset rearranged schedule, mum thanked me privately, not publicly. It wasn't about scorekeeping. It was about visibility. When you've spent years minimizing your own effort, you begin to doubt your perception. Writing it down anchored me in something factual. I also began preparing in ways no one could see. I updated my own will, something I had postponed. I met with a financial advisor to restructure my savings, not because of conflict, because clarity had arrived. If I were listed as executor for my parents, I wanted defined boundaries in place. I asked practical questions they hadn't considered: what provisions were made for care, what expectations existed around shared property, what legal responsibilities I was implicitly accepting. They were surprised by my thoroughness. "You don't have to worry about all that yet," my father said. "I'm not worried," I replied calmly. "I just prefer things defined." Defined? That word changed something in me. I also restructured my time. I enrolled in a certification course that required evening study. For years, I had avoided committing to anything that might conflict with potential family emergencies. Now, I committed intentionally. When my mother called during one of my study sessions, I let it go to voicemail. I returned it afterward. "I was in class," I said simply. "Oh," she replied, slightly thrown. "I didn't realize." Of course, she didn't. Because I had never made my growth visible. I had made myself perpetually accessible instead. The preparation wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a revenge arc. It was repositioning. I began redirecting my competence inward, investing it in my own future rather than absorbing every ripple from theirs. And something else became apparent, something they never noticed. When I wasn't solving everything instantly, they began negotiating among themselves. Leona volunteered to drive our parents to an appointment one afternoon because I had a work meeting. She sounded uncertain at first, then proud afterward. "It wasn't that complicated," she admitted later. I smiled. I had known that all along. But as long as I removed obstacles before others encountered them, no one developed confidence, including me. Because here's the uncomfortable truth: being the fixer had become part of my identity. Letting go required humility. It required trusting that others might stumble and that it wasn't my job to prevent every misstep. Quiet dominance isn't about control. It's about self-governance. I stopped over-explaining my unavailability. I stopped apologizing for prior commitments. I stopped cushioning every boundary with excessive reassurance. "I can't this evening. I won't be able to manage that. That sounds like something you can handle. No heat, no hostility." just a fact. What they never noticed was that I wasn't withdrawing love. I was withdrawing excess labor. And that distinction would matter more than anyone realized. Because preparation doesn't always look like movement. Sometimes it looks like stillness. And stillness, when chosen deliberately, rearranges more than confrontation ever could. The revelation didn't come from an argument. It came from paperwork. I was sitting across from a solicitor on a quiet Thursday afternoon. The office smelled faintly of polished wood and printer ink. I had taken the day off under the simple explanation of appointments. Technically, that wasn't untrue. I had decided to review the details of my parents' estate, not because I expected anything dramatic, but because I wanted clarity about the responsibility I had so casually accepted years earlier. The solicitor walked me through the documents carefully. My name is listed as executor, primary decision maker, administrative authority in the event of incapacity. Leona's name appeared, too, as beneficiary, shared assets, equal division. On the surface, everything was balanced, but the weight wasn't. If anything were to happen, the solicitor explained, you would be legally responsible for managing the estate, ensuring all debts are settled, distributing assets, handling tax matters, and communicating with institutions. I nodded. And if your sister disagrees with any decision I asked, you would still be legally obligated to proceed according to the will. But disputes can complicate matters. Complicate. Such a gentle word. I left the office with copies of the documents in my bag and a clarity I hadn't anticipated. I wasn't just the emotional emergency contact. I was the structural one. In crisis medical, logistical, legal, I would be the axis. Leona would receive equal outcomes. I would absorb disproportionate responsibility. And no one had ever paused to ask whether I consented to that imbalance. That realization wasn't angry. It was sobering. Because leverage isn't always about control over others. Sometimes it's about understanding the quiet authority already resting in your hands. I drove home slowly, the city passing in muted grey. When I entered my flat, I placed the documents on my dining table and sat in front of them without opening my laptop or turning on music. Just sitting. For the first time, I understood something fundamental. If I withdrew emotionally or administratively, the entire family structure would tremble, not collapse, but tremble. I had been mistaking my availability for kindness, but in truth, I had been underwriting the family's stability, and underwriting comes with cost. The private reveal wasn't that I had power over them. It was that I had power over my participation. I could redefine the terms, not by threatening, not by confronting, by clarifying expectations before a crisis ever arrives. A week later, during Sunday tea, I brought it up calmly. I reviewed the will with a solicitor, I said lightly, stirring my cup. My mother blinked. Oh, yes. I just wanted to understand the scope of responsibility. Leona looked mildly confused. Scope? It's quite involved, I replied. I'll need documented cooperation from both of you if the time ever comes, clear communication, agreed timelines. There was a subtle shift in the room. Not resistance, awareness. My father cleared his throat. Of course. Leona shifted in her seat. I mean, that's ages away. Perhaps, I said gently, but clarity now prevents strain later. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't dramatize. I simply placed responsibility back into shared view. For the first time, I saw it register the administrative weight I carried wasn't casual. It was consequential, and I had never treated it as such. That evening, alone again in my flat, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph, relief, because I no longer felt invisible. Even if they didn't fully grasp it yet, I did. I understood my position. I understood my leverage. And more importantly, I understood that silence was no longer passive. It was deliberate. And that knowledge changed the texture of every interaction that followed. Clarity creates options. And options demand choice. For weeks after the solicitor meeting, I lived in a quiet evaluation. Nothing explosive happened. No argument forced my hand. But internally, I was standing at a crossroads. I could continue as before, just slightly slower, slightly more boundaried, and allow the system to recalibrate gradually. Or I could make a structural change. Something irreversible. The decision arrived disguised as another small request. My parents were considering downsizing. The house was becoming harder to maintain, and property values had risen. Over tea one afternoon, My father mentioned they were thinking of putting my name on certain financial documents to make things easier in the future. It sounded practical. It sounded responsible. It sounded like more of the same. Just so you can manage everything smoothly if needed, he added. I felt the familiar pull, the expectation that I would nod, accept, absorb. Leona was present, scrolling lightly on her phone. No one looked at her. They looked at me, and in that quiet moment, I saw the entire trajectory of my future if I said yes automatically. More signatures, more silent obligations, more invisible labor disguised as trust. There's a particular kind of fatigue that comes from carrying weight no one else notices. And I realized I was done volunteering for expansion. I won't be added to anything new, I said calmly. The room paused. My mother blinked. What do you mean? I mean, I'm happy to remain executor as currently written. But I won't take on additional financial authority or property responsibility unless it's formally structured with equal accountability. The words were measured, not sharp. Leona looked up now. Equal accountability, she repeated. Yes, I said. If my name goes on something, so does yours. If responsibility increases, it increases proportionally. There it was. Not confrontation. Redefinition. My father frowned slightly. It's just easier if one person... Easier for whom I asked gently. Silence again. Not hostile, just exposed. For the first time, the assumption that I would carry extra weight without question had been interrupted before it settled. They weren't angry. They were recalculating. And I understood something profound in that pause. My compliance had been the adhesive holding certain imbalances in place. Without it, everyone had to participate more consciously. Later that evening, alone in my flat, I acknowledged what had just happened. I had chosen the irreversible option, not in paperwork, in identity. I was no longer the default absorber. From that moment forward, every responsibility would be examined before accepted. That boundary cannot be unseen once drawn. And here's what made it irreversible. I didn't justify it emotionally. I didn't defend it with stories of exhaustion or sacrifice. I simply stated a principle: shared responsibility, fair distribution, defined consent. Once you articulate that calmly, you cannot convincingly return to silent overextension without betraying yourself. The decision point wasn't loud. No one stormed out. No voices rose. But the family dynamic shifted on its axis, because for the first time in my life, I had declined expansion before it became an expectation. And that changed the balance of everything. After that conversation, I didn't wait for reactions. I acted quietly, not in opposition, in alignment. First, I formalized my own boundaries legally. I updated a written agreement clarifying the scope of my role as executor. I requested that any future financial decisions involving my name require documented consent from both my parents and shared acknowledgement from Leona. No accusations, just structure. I sent the draft by email, subject line for clarity and future ease. The language was neutral, professional, almost clinical. If anyone expected emotional commentary, they didn't receive it. Second, I separated logistics from affection. Previously, if my mother called to chat, I would inevitably end up troubleshooting something by the end of the conversation. Now, if a discussion shifted into problem solving, I paused. That sounds like something we can schedule properly. I'd say, schedule. The word changed everything. Spontaneous delegation became planned collaboration. And planned collaboration requires participation from more than one person. I also made a personal financial move that no one in my family knew about. I increased my long-term investments and shifted part of my savings into an independent trust structure, not to hide anything, but to ensure that my future was insulated from potential estate complications. I wasn't preparing for conflict. I was preparing for autonomy. At work, I accepted a leadership track opportunity that required occasional travel. In the past, I would have declined, anticipating that family needs might arise. This time, I signed the agreement without hesitation. If an emergency occurred, it would be handled collectively, or it would wait. The most fascinating part: no one noticed immediately, because structural change, when done quietly, looks like nothing at first. There were small ripples. My mother began phrasing requests differently. Would you be available to help with this instead of, can you sort this? Leona, surprisingly, stepped forward in minor ways. She offered to manage a utility transfer for our parents without prompting. I didn't praise her excessively. I didn't highlight the shift. I simply allowed it. When people step into responsibility, they don't need applause, they need space. That was something I had never given them before. I had filled every gap so quickly that no one else had room to grow. By not moving instantly, I created friction, and friction builds strength. There was one evening that confirmed everything. My father called while I was on a train returning from a work seminar in Edinburgh. "I can't log into the online banking," he said, mild irritation in his voice. In the past, I would have guided him step by step in real time. Instead, I said calmly, "I'm traveling. I'll be home tomorrow evening. If it's urgent, the bank has a helpline." He hesitated. "Then right? Yes, of course." The call ended. No crisis. No accusation. Just an adjustment. I stared out the train window at the blurred countryside and felt something unfamiliar. Lightness. Not because I was withholding help, but because I was no longer performing indispensability. I was living. Moving in silence doesn't mean hiding. It means acting without announcement. And while my family slowly recalibrated to my new pace, they hadn't yet felt the full consequence of my earlier role. Because when someone has always been the immediate responder, their absence isn't noticeable until a true emergency tests the system. And that test was coming. Not dramatic, not catastrophic, but revealing. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of it. I was ready to observe. The first real consequence didn't look like a loss. It looked like confusion. It happened on a Thursday morning when my mother accidentally double-booked 2 medical appointments, one for herself, one for my father, at opposite ends of the city. In the past, this would have unfolded predictably. She would call me. I would rearrange my schedule. I would drive one of them. The problem would dissolve before inconvenience fully formed. This time, I was in a quarterly strategy meeting at work. My phone buzzed repeatedly in my bag. When I checked it during a break, there were 4 missed calls and a message in the family group chat. "Almira, urgent. Can you call?" I read it. I didn't respond immediately. Not to prove a point, not to punish, because I was in a meeting. That distinction mattered to me. 30 minutes later, another message appeared. "Leona, what's going on?" My mother explained the scheduling error. Then silence. 10 minutes passed. Then Leona replied again. "Okay, I can take Dad. Mum, can you get a taxi? I'll meet you after." I watched the thread unfold without typing. Logistics were exchanged, times coordinated. No escalation, no blame, just effort. By the time I responded calmly, an hour later, the solution was already in motion. "Looks sorted." I wrote, "Let me know if you need anything afterward." The reply from my mother was short. "Yes, all handled." There was something different in the tone. Not resentment. Not anger. Just awareness. Later that evening, my father called. "You were busy today," he said casually. "Yes, quarterly reviews." A pause. "Well, it worked out. I'm glad." Another pause. It was subtle, but I could hear the recalibration happening in real time. For years, my immediate intervention had prevented them from ever experiencing the mild inconvenience of coordinating without me. Now they were experiencing it. And surviving it. The second consequence came more quietly. A family dinner invitation arrived with shorter notice than usual. When I declined because I already had plans, there was no attempt to reschedule around me. The dinner went ahead without adjustment. That stung briefly. But I recognized it for what it was, redistribution. For years, plans had bent around Leona's availability. Now, instead of bending around mine, they proceeded neutrally, no longer orbiting a single person. It felt strangely equal. And equality, when you've been overfunctioning, can initially resemble exclusion. But it isn't. It's a balance. The most telling shift came from Leona herself. One evening, she called not in crisis, not breathless. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course. You've been different. Not in a bad way, just not jumping in like you used to." I smiled slightly. "I've just been pacing myself." There was a long pause on the line. "I didn't realize how much you were doing," she admitted quietly. That sentence wasn't dramatic, but it was honest. And honesty, even small signals that perception has changed. Consequences don't always arrive as punishment. Sometimes they arrive as recognition. The family hadn't fallen apart. They hadn't accused me of abandonment. They had adjusted, but adjustment carries emotion. Confusion, mild discomfort, subtle reevaluation. For the first time, the system was operating without automatic reinforcement. And in that space, something unexpected began to surface. Respect! Not loud, not announced, just a growing awareness that my time, my energy, my presence were not default settings. They were choices, and choices, once visible, are valued differently. The shift was gradual, but it was irreversible, because once people feel the absence of something they assumed was guaranteed, they begin to understand its worth. The moment it became undeniable wasn't a catastrophe. It was a hospital corridor. My father had a minor fall, nothing life-threatening, but enough to require observation overnight. My mother called me while I was in the middle of preparing a presentation for a regional board review. Her voice was strained. "We're at A&E. They're admitting him for monitoring." I stood very still. Old instincts surged forward. "Cancel everything. Grab your coat. Drive immediately." Instead, I asked, "Is he stable?" "Yes." "Is Leona there?" A pause. "She's on her way." That mattered. "I have a presentation first thing in the morning," I said carefully. "I can come after." Silence. Not angry. Just processing. "In the past, you would have already been here," my mother said quietly. She wasn't accusing me. She was remembering. "I know," I replied. And that was the entire confrontation. When I arrived the next afternoon, Leona was sitting beside my father's bed, looking tired but composed. She had handled the admission paperwork, spoken to the nurse, organized the overnight bag. She looked up at me with something new in her expression. Not dependency. Understanding. "It wasn't that complicated," she said softly. I nodded. I never thought it was. The real shift happened later, outside in the hospital cafe. My mother stirred her tea absent-mindedly. "I didn't realize how much we leaned on you," she admitted. I didn't rush to reassure her. For years, I would have said, "It's fine, I didn't mind." Instead, I allowed the truth to breathe between us. "You did," I said gently, "and I let you." Her eyes flicked up. There it was, the mutual recognition. This wasn't about blame. It was about the pattern. "You could have said something," she whispered. "I didn't know how," I replied, because I thought being dependable was how I earned my place. The honesty surprised even me. She reached across the small cafe table and touched my hand. "You never had to earn it." Maybe not. But love is interpreted through behavior, not intention. And behavior had told a different story for years. By the time my father was discharged, the dynamic had shifted permanently. Leona volunteered to manage follow-up appointments, my mother asked before assuming. My father thanked me not for stepping in, but for trusting them to handle it. And here's the quiet truth. It was too late to return to the old version of me. Not because they were unwilling, because I was. Once you feel what it's like to move without constant emotional obligation, you cannot convincingly return to overextension. Once people see you as someone with limits, they cannot fully unsee it either. The family wasn't fractured, but the illusion that I was the automatic first responder was gone. There was a brief period of discomfort, an unspoken recalibration where everyone was cautious, slightly unsure of the new boundaries. But no one tried to force the old pattern back into place. And that, more than anything, confirmed the truth. The imbalance had persisted because I sustained it. When I stopped sustaining it, it dissolved. Not overnight, but irreversibly. Too late to fix the old system. Just in time to build a better one. The conversation that sealed everything happened at my parents' dining table on a quiet Sunday afternoon. No crisis, no raised voices, no dramatic prelude. Just roast potatoes, soft light through the curtains, and an atmosphere that felt aware. Leona had stayed behind after clearing the dishes. My father was in the garden. My mother folded napkins with unnecessary precision. "I've been thinking," Leona said carefully, "about how things used to be." I waited. "You carried a lot," she continued, "and I didn't really question it." There was no defensiveness in her tone, just a reflection. "I didn't question it either," I replied. "That was important. Confrontation without heat requires shared ownership." She leaned back in her chair. "I think I assumed you preferred it, being the organized one, the one in control." "I did prefer structure," I said, "but I didn't prefer being the default." She nodded slowly, absorbing that. My mother joined the table again, hands clasped. "It wasn't favoritism," she said quietly. "It was habit." "I know," I answered, and I meant it. There was no villain in this story, no malicious intent, just patterns reinforced by convenience. My father came inside, wiping his hands on a cloth. He sensed the gravity of the conversation immediately. "Are we having a tribunal?" he asked lightly. A small smile moved around the table. "No," I said calmly, "just an audit." That word made him pause. I explained without accusation how immediate responsiveness had slowly turned into expectation, how expectation had become structure, how structure had left little room for my own expansion. I didn't recount every slight. I didn't bring up the birthday dinner, the graduation, or the countless small adjustments. I focused on the principle. When I stopped answering first, I said evenly, everything slowed down. And that wasn't a bad thing. It just showed us what was actually necessary and what wasn't. Silence settled again. But it wasn't tense. It was contemplative. My father spoke first. "I suppose we got comfortable," he admitted. "Comfortable knowing you'd handle things." "Yes," I replied. "And I got comfortable proving that I could." Leona looked at me with something close to regret. "I don't want you to feel like you're on the outside," she said. I answered honestly. "I just don't want to be the infrastructure." That sentence landed cleanly. Not emotional, not dramatic, just precise. There was no apology ceremony, no dramatic reconciliation. Instead, there was something quieter, a collective understanding that the system had been recalibrated. From that day forward, decisions were discussed more evenly, responsibilities were distributed consciously. When something arose, the question shifted from Almira, "Can you sort this?" to "Who's best placed to handle this?" It seems small, but language reveals mindset. And the mindset had changed. As I drove home that evening, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. Confrontation without heat doesn't create spectacle. It creates alignment. No one was shamed, no one was exposed, but the role I had once inhabited, invisible, automatic, indispensable, no longer existed. And I had let it go without raising my voice once. I am still the dependable one. That didn't disappear. I still carry a planner. I still arrive prepared. I still notice what others overlook. The difference is I no longer confuse capability with obligation. These days, when my phone rings, I don't feel the reflexive tightening in my chest. I answer because I choose to, not because I'm bracing for impact. I travel more now. I accepted a regional leadership role at work that requires me to be unavailable at times. When I'm on a train or in a meeting, I stay there fully present without scanning for potential emergencies back home. And here's the remarkable thing. My family functions. Not perfectly, but honestly, Leona has grown into responsibility in ways I never anticipated. Not because she was forced, but because space required her to. My parents ask instead of assuming. They plan instead of default. They pause instead of reaching immediately for my name. And when I do step in, when I genuinely want to, it feels different. It feels seen. The gratitude lands because it isn't automatic anymore. There's a quiet dignity in choosing when to carry weight. I no longer perform strength to secure belonging. I belong because I am part of the family, not because I am the family's infrastructure. That internal shift changed more than my relationships. It changed how I see myself. For years, I defined my worth by utility. If I was helpful, I was valuable. If I was steady, I was loved. Now I define my worth by alignment. If something costs too much emotionally, I examine it before agreeing. If a request feels unbalanced, I articulate it calmly. I don't dramatize boundaries. I embody them. And something unexpected happened as a result. The space I reclaimed, the emotional bandwidth I stopped donating automatically allowed me to deepen parts of my life I had neglected. Friendships strengthened, hobbies resurfaced. I started painting again on quiet Saturday mornings, something I hadn't done since university. Not because I didn't have time before, but because I was always on call. I am no longer on call. I am available. There's a difference. Availability is a gift. On call is a duty. When I think back to the woman who believed love had to be earned through usefulness, I feel compassion for her. She wasn't weak. She was generous. She just hadn't learned that generosity without limits quietly erodes self-respect. Now, when I sit at family dinners, I'm not positioned at the edge of the table anymore. Not physically, energetically. I don't monitor everything. I don't anticipate every need. I allow small inconveniences to exist without rushing to smooth them. And in that imperfection, there is balance. I am still the emergency contact on paper, but I am no longer the emotional first responder by default. I am Almira, capable, present, self-governed, and that identity doesn't require applause. It requires alignment. For a long time, I believed the strongest people were the ones who answered first. The ones who showed up immediately, who absorbed inconvenience without flinching, who never let anything fall apart. But strength without boundaries becomes silent self-erasure. And self-erasure, repeated long enough, starts to look like personality instead of pattern. When I stopped answering first, everything slowed down. Not in a catastrophic way, in a clarifying way. People thought more, shared more, stepped forward more, and I learned something that changed me permanently. If you are always available, you will eventually be taken for granted, not because people are cruel, but because humans adapt to what is consistent. I wasn't unloved. I was over-relied upon. There's a difference. This story was never about revenge. It was never about punishing my family or proving a point. It was about reclaiming consent in roles I had quietly accepted. You can be dependable without being depleted. You can be supportive without being structural. You can love deeply without dissolving yourself in the process. The day I stopped responding automatically, I didn't lose my place in my family. I found it. A place where help is offered, not assumed, where responsibility is shared, not silently assigned, where strength is chosen, not extracted. If you see yourself in this, if you are the one everyone calls first, the one who can handle it, the one who never complains, I want to ask you something gently. Are you being cherished or just relied upon? And if you stopped answering first tomorrow, what would actually happen? I'd love to hear your story in the comments.